I woke up to the smell of burnt toast and the sound of someone humming off-key to Fleetwood Mac. That was my first clue that this weekend wasn't going to go as planned. Ben had always been a little chaotic in the mornings. Even when we were kids, camping with our dads and scraping burnt marshmallows off sticks, he was the one clanging pans around while the rest of us tried to sleep off the chill of a mountain night. Now, 2 decades later, nothing much had changed, except maybe me. Somewhere along the way, our friendship had stopped being easy. Not bad. Just complicated. The cabin creaked as I sat up on the couch, rubbing sleep from my eyes and trying to remember why I'd volunteered for this trip in the first place. Oh, right, Ben's idea. A reunion, he'd called it. One last guy's weekend before everything changes, he said with a crooked grin I pretended not to read too deeply into. He was getting married. That's what I'd been told, by him, by our mutual friends, even by the email thread that somehow included photos of linen table runners and cake tastings. But the bride? Still a mystery. He never talked about her in any real way. And when I asked, he'd deflect, toss a pillow at my head, or tell me I asked too many damn questions. The kettle shrieked in the kitchen. I patted in on cold floorboards, heart hammering for no good reason. There he was, shirtless, hair a mess, golden light hitting the scruff on his jaw just right. He was stirring sugar into 2 mugs and already knew I'd come looking. "Morning, sleepyhead," he said without turning around. He always made coffee for me without asking. "Cream, no sugar." "Is that my hoodie?" I asked, pointing to the faded gray one stretched across his back. Ben glanced over his shoulder, smirking. "You left it in my truck last fall." Finders keepers. There it was again, our easy rhythm, the familiar banter, the line we'd never quite crossed. Except lately, I kept wondering what would happen if we did. Outside the windows, the lake shimmered like glass. The trees were already starting to turn, bleeding hints of orange and red. A sign of change. Of endings. Or maybe beginnings. This weekend was supposed to be about nostalgia, but I had a feeling it was going to reveal more than either of us were ready for. Ben and I had known each other since we were 9. Our dads were college roommates who thought it'd be poetic to bring their sons on the same camping trips they used to take, all flannel shirts, bug spray, and badly grilled hot dogs. That first trip, Ben dared me to eat a worm and I dared him to pee on an electric fence. We were inseparable by the end of the weekend, 2 idiots who thought loyalty meant sticking together through bee stings, scraped knees, and terrible decisions. Even now, in our 30s, that loyalty hadn't faded. If anything, it had sharpened into something quieter, unspoken. We didn't need to talk every day or even every week. But when things got heavy, when my dad passed, when Ben nearly failed out of his junior year, when my last relationship ended like a car crash in slow motion, he was there. Not always with the right words, but with a 6-pack and that ridiculous smirk that said, "You're not alone, Dos. Remember the time you got lost in the woods because you thought moss always grows on the north side of trees?" Ben asked, handing me a plate of eggs with the kind of proud confidence that suggested they might be edible. "I maintain that it does," I said, stabbing a fork into the overcooked yolk. "The trees were just confused." He laughed, that deep, full-body sound that made something in my chest flutter. I hated how easily he did that, how effortlessly he could make everything feel lighter. We ate on the porch, the wooden steps creaking beneath us as we watched the lake ripple in the morning breeze. It was quiet, peaceful. The kind of quiet that made you say things you normally wouldn't. "You ever think about how different things would be if we hadn't met?" I asked. Ben didn't answer right away. He just looked out at the water, the sun catching in his hair. "No," he said eventually, "because I can't picture it. And I don't want to." I nodded, swallowing more than just eggs. I wanted to ask if that meant something more, if he felt the same tension I'd been trying to ignore. But the words stuck somewhere behind my teeth. Later, while unloading gear from the car, we discovered the first hitch in our perfect weekend. Only one sleeping bag. The other, apparently, had been left behind in his garage because Ben thought I packed it. "You thought I packed your sleeping bag?" Technically, I thought I'd grabbed both. It was dark. I was running late. "You're the planner." I crossed my arms. "So what's the plan now?" "Flip a coin." Ben tossed a crooked grin over his shoulder as he carried a duffel into the cabin. We'll figure it out. Worst case, we cuddle. You're not that prickly. I'm not cuddling you. We'll see. That night, as we sat in front of the fire pit with beers in hand and stars scattered overhead like confetti, I found myself watching the way the flames danced in his eyes. His face was flushed from the heat, or maybe the alcohol, and every time our hands brushed when reaching for the chips, I felt something spark. We talked about nothing and everything: work, memories, things we missed and things we regretted. There were pauses too, but never awkward. Just full. Like we were both trying to say something without saying it. At one point, he leaned over to grab another log, and his hand brushed my knee. It lingered, just a second too long. He didn't move away immediately. Neither did I. You okay? He asked softly, almost like he already knew the answer. Yeah, I lied, eyes flicking to his lips before I caught myself and looked away. That night, we ended up sleeping side by side in the same bag. There wasn't really another choice. The cabin had one usable bed, which Ben insisted I take, but it was too damn cold to go without cover. He didn't touch me. Not really. But at some point, I felt his leg press lightly against mine. His breathing slowed, evening out. I was wide awake, heart pounding. That closeness, intentional or not, was the kind of quiet that screamed. And I couldn't ignore it much longer. The storm rolled in quicker than either of us expected. One minute the lake was glassy and still, and the next, the wind picked up with a sharp whistle and the trees started bending like they were whispering secrets to each other. Ben and I were halfway through a short hike on the ridge trail behind the cabin when the first fat drops hit. You didn't check the weather? I shouted, pulling my hoodie over my head as the rain began to fall in earnest. He glanced up at the sky, squinting. I did, yesterday. It said, partly cloudy, not impending biblical flood. We both laughed, even as we broke into a run, ducking beneath the heavy canopy. The rain pelted through the leaves like the forest had suddenly sprung a leak. It was too far to get back to the cabin before getting soaked through, and I knew from memory there was an old trail shelter about a half-mile ahead. Come on, I said, grabbing his wrist and pulling him in the direction I hoped still led to it. By the time we made it to the small wooden lean-to, we were drenched, gasping, and laughing like idiots. I dropped onto the splintered bench and pulled off my soaked hoodie, shaking out my hair. Ben followed, brushing water off his arms, his t-shirt plastered to his chest. Jesus, he muttered, wringing it out. I feel like a drowned cat. You look like one, I said, smiling. He stuck his tongue out at me and sat down, thigh pressing against mine on the narrow bench. There wasn't room to avoid touching. Not in that tiny shelter, not with the rain coming in sideways and the cold seeping into our bones. For a few minutes, we were quiet, just the sound of rain and our breathing filling the space. Then Ben spoke. I don't mind getting stuck like this, he said, voice low. With you. I turned to look at him, and that was a mistake. His eyes were soft, open, and there was a smile curling at the corner of his lips that made my stomach twist. I forced a chuckle. You're just saying that because you don't have cell signal and I'm the only human available. He didn't laugh. Instead, he looked at me like I'd missed something important. No. I mean it. I looked away. My heart was pounding so loud I was sure he could hear it. I could feel the heat of his skin through his shirt, the brush of his arm against mine. Every nerve in my body was on high alert, craving more and terrified of what that meant. This was Ben, my best friend. The guy I'd grown up with, who knew my worst habits, my childhood fears, the way I liked my coffee. Who once held me while I cried in the parking lot after my last breakup and said nothing because he knew words would only make it worse. And I wanted him. God, I wanted him. But if I reached for him and he didn't feel the same way, if I broke this thing between us, I didn't know if I could live with that. I always liked the rain, he said suddenly, breaking the silence again. Remember when we used to sit on your porch during storms and pretend we were stranded on some epic adventure? Yeah, I said, grateful for the distraction. You always insisted we were treasure hunters. I wanted to be pirates. You said pirates were lazy. He laughed, that full sound that lit something warm in my chest. Well, you were always the romantic. that made me glance at him. Is that what I was? He didn't answer, just met my gaze and held it. Something about the way he looked at me, like I was a map he'd been tracing for years, made my breath catch. The tension stretched between us like the taut edge of a bowstring. Neither of us moved, but everything felt like motion. Our eyes locked, bodies barely touching, the air too thick, too electric. Every muscle in my body begged to close the distance. Then his hand brushed against mine. It was nothing really, just fingers grazing fingers on the worn bench. But he didn't pull away. Neither did I. The rain thundered around us, loud and wild, but inside the shelter everything went still. I could feel every inch of where we touched, barely there, but impossibly loud. My fingers twitched, a reflex, and his twitched in return. We sat like that for what felt like hours, saying nothing, breathing shallow, hearts racing. When he finally spoke, it was soft. Almost a whisper. Do you ever think about things being different? I turned toward him slowly, my heart a clenched fist in my chest. Different how? Ben looked down at our hands, where our pinkies still barely touched. Like if we weren't just this friends. I didn't know what to say. My mouth opened, then closed. I could feel my throat tighten. The truth hovered there, so close I could taste it. But fear is a funny thing. It doesn't always scream. Sometimes it just whispers, what if you lose him? So instead I said, sometimes. He nodded, like that was enough for now. And maybe it was. We didn't move. The rain kept falling. Our hands stayed right there, a single point of contact that meant everything and nothing. And I knew, no matter what came next, we'd already crossed a line. The storm didn't let up until after midnight. By then, the temperature had dropped, and our clothes were still damp, clinging to our skin like second thoughts. We made it back to the cabin in silence, shoes squelching through the muddy path, our earlier moments still hanging heavy between us like fog. Neither of us brought it up, what he'd said in the shelter, how close we'd come to something that felt like more. But I could feel it in every glance, every breath, every accidental touch that didn't feel accidental anymore. I peeled off my wet clothes in the tiny bathroom, heart hammering, nerves frayed to the edge. I stared at myself in the mirror. My hair was a mess, my eyes looked tired. There was a flush high in my cheeks I couldn't blame on the rain. I splashed cold water on my face and tried to breathe, to find my footing again. But it was no use. I was unraveling. Back in the main room, Ben was already in bed. Or rather, in the shared sleeping bag on the floor, since we'd agreed, stupidly, that it felt more nostalgic than taking the bed. That decision had seemed harmless when we were packing gear, not when every part of me ached with want and fear. He looked up as I walked in, propped on one elbow, hair still damp, face half lit by the flickering fire. You good? He asked. Yeah, I lied again. Just cold. He lifted the flap of the bag. Get in before you freeze to death. I did. Slowly, carefully, trying not to brush too much of him. But it was impossible in such a tight space. Our legs tangled immediately, and I felt the heat of him all along my side. My arm rested awkwardly near his chest, my breath catching when I realized I could feel the steady thud of his heart. We lay like that for a long time, listening to the fire crackle, to the wind outside, to everything unsaid between us. And then he spoke. I'm not getting married. The words sliced through the quiet. I turned to look at him, heart skipping. What? Ben was staring up at the wooden beams above us, voice flat, like he'd practiced it 100 times. I called it off a few weeks ago. Never really told anyone. Figured it'd make things complicated. My chest tightened. Why? He gave a soft, breathless laugh. Why not? She didn't really know me. Not the parts that mattered. He turned to face me, our noses inches apart. Not like you do. The air between us changed, charged, dangerous, necessary. You should have told me, I said, voice barely above a whisper. I didn't know how, he admitted. And maybe I was afraid. Of what? He didn't answer right away. He reached out, brushing his fingers along my wrist, where my pulse fluttered like wings. You ever feel like, if you say something out loud, it becomes real? And once it's real, You can't take it back. I nodded, throat dry. He looked at me then, really looked, and his eyes were nothing but raw honesty. That night in the shelter, I wasn't talking about maybe wanting things to be different. I've been thinking about it for a long time. About you. My heart stopped. You mean? He nodded, cutting me off. I don't know when it changed. Maybe it was always there, and I was too scared to name it. But I can't keep pretending it's nothing. Not when you're all I think about lately. Not when being around you feels like home and losing you feels like the end of something I wouldn't survive. I swallowed hard, everything inside me trembling. I'd imagined this. 1,000 versions of this. But none of them had prepared me for how it would feel. The relief, the ache, the sudden overwhelming fear that I'd waited too long. You're not going to lose me, I said, voice cracking. But I need you to know, this isn't just you. He went still beside me. I've been trying to ignore it for months. Telling myself it's just friendship, that it'd go away. But then you do something stupid like wear my hoodie, or make coffee the exact way I like it without asking, or say some ridiculous thing that makes me laugh when I don't want to. I let out a shaky breath. And I realize I don't want it to go away. I want this. I want you. But I didn't want to ruin what we had. He shifted closer, forehead almost touching mine. You're not ruining anything. I looked into his eyes. Are you sure? Ben nodded slowly, his hand finding mine in the space between us. I've never been more sure of anything. And then, finally, he leaned in. It wasn't rushed. There was no urgency, no heat demanding to be answered. Just a soft, tentative kiss that tasted like rain and hesitation and years of things left unsaid. His lips brushed mine gently, once, then again, more certain the second time. I melted into it, into him, into the moment that changed everything. When we pulled back, he rested his forehead against mine. You okay? He asked. I laughed, breathless. Yeah. Just wondering if this is some fever dream I'll wake up from. Ben smiled, thumb brushing my cheek. If it is, I'm not letting you wake up. We stayed like that for a long time. Close, quiet, tangled together in the dark like we'd been built to fit that way. I felt the tension in my chest begin to loosen, felt something in me exhale that had been holding its breath for years. Eventually, he pulled me into his arms, our legs fitting together naturally, like puzzle pieces that had been waiting to find each other. This changes everything, I whispered. Yeah, he said, pressing a kiss to the top of my head. But not in a bad way. And just like that, I wasn't afraid anymore. Not of the shift, not of what it meant. Because whatever came next, whatever challenges we had to face, I knew one thing with absolute certainty. We'd face it together. The morning after felt like a dream, like the kind of memory you're afraid to touch in case it disappears. Sunlight filtered softly through the cabin's window, casting golden stripes across the wooden floor and warming the air that still held the faint smell of ash and pine. I blinked awake slowly, my cheek resting on Ben's chest, his arms slung loosely around my back. His heartbeat, steady and real, was the first sound I registered. For a minute I just lay there, afraid to move. Afraid it would all unravel if I did. But then his fingers traced a lazy circle between my shoulder blades and I knew he was awake too. You always steal the covers, he murmured, voice raspy with sleep. I lifted my head to look at him, hair sticking up at every angle. Do not. You just sleep like a starfish. Not my fault you're built like a space heater, he smirked, brushing a bit of hair off my forehead. I let out a breathless laugh. This is weird, right? Ben tilted his head, thoughtful. Yeah. But good weird. The kind you don't want to go back from. I nodded, my smile softening. Same. There was something about seeing him this way, in the quiet after the storm, both literal and emotional, that made everything feel lighter. Like we'd been carrying the weight of something unnamed for too long, and now that it had a shape, we could finally breathe. We didn't rush out of bed. Just lay there, limbs tangled, sharing lazy smiles and quiet touches. He kissed my temple once, so casually it felt like we'd done this forever. And I kissed the corner of his mouth in return, feeling the spark jump between us like a shared secret. Eventually, though, reality knocked. We should talk about what happens now, I said, shifting slightly so I could see his face better. Ben sighed, but not unhappily. I was hoping we'd have at least one coffee before diving into the deep stuff. I grinned. You can have coffee after you tell me if we're dating or just emotionally entangled camping brothers. He laughed, shaking his head. We're dating, you idiot. Unless you plan to break my heart before breakfast. Depends, I teased. Are you making the eggs? Only if you promise not to judge my toast-to-butter ratio. I make no such promises. The laughter settled into something quieter, more serious. His hand found mine again under the blanket, fingers intertwining like it was second nature. There's going to be stuff to figure out, he said after a moment. People asking questions. My familyers. Friends who thought we were just us, I finished. He nodded. I'm not scared of any of that. I just don't want to screw this up. I've been close to you for so long I don't know how to be anything else. But now I want to be more. I squeezed his hand. We'll take it slow. Figure it out together. No scripts. No pressure. Ben looked at me then and I swear, his eyes had never looked softer. You sure? I leaned in, pressing my forehead to his. Ben, I've been falling for you since you made me that dumb Spotify playlist 2 summers ago. He laughed into my neck, muffling the sound. You said you hated it. I lied. I listened to it for weeks. Well damn, he whispered. Wish I'd known. I could have added fewer Avril Lavigne songs. Blasphemy, I gasped, shoving him playfully. You leave, skater boy, out of this. He rolled on top of me with a grin, pinning me gently. No promises. Our laughter faded into kisses again, this time less tentative, more familiar, like a rhythm we were slowly learning. The warmth between us wasn't just physical anymore. It was emotional, electric, honest. And as we lay there, surrounded by trees and quiet and the fading echoes of a thunderstorm, I realized something. We weren't the same people we were before last night. We were something new. Something fragile but full of potential. And I wanted to see exactly where it could go. We packed up the cabin in a slow, meandering rhythm. Ben folded the sleeping bag with exaggerated care, making a joke about how it had seen more emotional tension than a season of The Bachelor. I rolled my eyes but didn't argue. He wasn't wrong. The storm had passed, leaving the world crisp and clean. The sky was that kind of impossible blue that only happens after a downpour, bright, open, and full of things you don't know yet. Everything smelled like pine and wet earth and beginnings. Ben handed me my thermos with a lopsided smile. Peace offering. Coffee with exactly 3 drops of oat milk and just enough cinnamon to make me gag. You love it, I said, bumping my shoulder against his. I love you, he said before he could stop himself. My heart stuttered. Not in a panicked way. Not in a what did he just say kind of way. In the kind of way that told me, this is real. I didn't say it back right away. I didn't have to. I just looked at him, let my fingers curl around his, and let the quiet settle in around us, warm and full. Because I knew he felt it, just like I did. Some truths didn't need to be rushed. Some were just understood. Still, the words came later. Not in a grand speech, not in some perfectly timed cinematic moment. But on the drive back, somewhere between a poorly tuned radio station and the winding road through the pines, I looked at him, hair a mess, singing off-key to a song he pretended not to like, and I said, I love you too. He didn't stop driving. Didn't say anything at first. Just reached across the console and took my hand, holding it like it was the most natural thing in the world. And maybe it was. We talked more seriously over lunch at a roadside diner, the kind with peeling linoleum and waitresses who called everyone hon, about what it meant, what came next. About his family, who he hadn't come out to. About mine, who probably already knew. About what it meant to go from best friends to boyfriends when the lines had been blurry for so long. I don't want to lose this, I said. The jokes. The easy stuff. You won't, he said, stirring sugar into his coffee. We're not changing who we are. We're just adding to it. Like emotional DLC, I muttered. Ben grinned. Exactly. He reached across the table then, taking my pinky in his. Not the whole hand, not something flashy. Just that one small touch, quiet and steady, like a promise he wasn't rushing to say out loud. "Let's take it slow," I said. "I'm not going anywhere," he replied. That night, back at my apartment, he crashed on the couch as usual, but we didn't pretend anymore. We sat with our legs tangled under a blanket, watching old episodes of Scrubs and laughing too hard at the dumb jokes we already knew by heart. At one point, he leaned his head on my shoulder and just stayed there. No hesitation. No joke to cut the tension. Just a simple truth made physical. Before bed, as I was brushing my teeth, he came up behind me and wrapped his arms around my waist, resting his chin on my shoulder. We made eye contact in the mirror, and for a moment, everything felt still. "I don't know what the next few months look like," I said. "Me neither," he replied, squeezing me gently. "But I know I want them with you." The next morning, I woke up to the sound of a pan clinking in the kitchen. Ben stood by the stove, barefoot, wearing my hoodie, humming some ridiculous Avril Lavigne song off-key. He turned, spatula in hand, and said, "Your son's making breakfast. Hope you're proud." I just stared for a moment. At the absurdity. At the comfort. At him. And something in me settled, deep and certain. I was proud. Because this was the start of something good. And it was just the beginning.